Picture this. You're in Manhattan's most expensive hotel, surrounded by millionaires in $1,000 suits. Suddenly, the hired pianist collapses. Dead silence fills the room. Then, from the corner, a janitor in work clothes walks to the grand piano. What happens in the next 5 minutes will make you question everything you think you know about talent and worth. Stay with me, because this true story will leave you speechless. Marcus Williams had been mopping the marble floors of the Plaza Hotel for 3 years, and in all that time, he might as well have been a ghost. Every morning at 5 a.m., he'd enter through the service entrance, change into his gray uniform, and begin his daily routine of making one of New York's most prestigious hotels sparkle for guests who could afford to spend more on a single night than he made in a month. The Plaza wasn't just any hotel. It was where oil executives closed billion-dollar deals over breakfast, where tech moguls announced mergers that would reshape industries, where foreign diplomats negotiated treaties that would appear on tomorrow's front pages. And Marcus? He was the man who emptied their trash cans. At 32, Marcus had learned to move through the hotel's opulent corridors like a shadow. He'd perfected the art of cleaning around conversations without being noticed, of restocking towels while millionaires discussed stock portfolios worth more than entire neighborhoods. The guests rarely made eye contact with him. When they did acknowledge his existence, it was usually to complain about a missed spot on a mirror or a towel folded incorrectly. But Marcus had a secret. Every night after his shift, when the hotel's grand ballroom sat empty and dark, he would slip inside and sit at the massive Steinway concert grand piano that dominated the space. His fingers, calloused from years of manual labor, would dance across the keys with a precision and passion that would have stunned anyone who bothered to listen. Marcus had been playing piano since he was 7 years old. His grandmother, a church organist in Detroit, had recognized his gift early and sacrificed everything to pay for lessons. By the time he was 16, music teachers were calling him a prodigy. Juilliard had sent him acceptance letters. His future seemed written in golden notes across staff paper. Then life happened. His grandmother fell ill, medical bills mounted, and Marcus made the choice that would define the next 15 years of his existence. He dropped out of high school, took any job he could find, and watched his musical dreams fade into the background like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now worked in a place where live classical music filled the air during every major event, performed by musicians who had walked the path he'd been forced to abandon. Sometimes, as he cleaned the ballroom after concerts, he'd find sheet music left behind by visiting performers. He'd study the compositions, his mind automatically hearing the melodies, his fingers unconsciously moving as if playing along. 3 years of invisibility had taught Marcus to observe everything and expect nothing. He'd learned which guests tipped the housekeeping staff generously and which ones complained to management about every minor inconvenience. He'd witnessed hostile takeovers planned over champagne, watched marriages' proposal unfold beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, and seen powerful people at their most vulnerable moments. The hotel's regular events followed predictable patterns. Corporate galas always started with networking cocktails, followed by dinner presentations, and ended with entertainment that reinforced whatever message the host company wanted to send. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was Harrison Enterprises' annual investor meeting, and the energy in the building felt electric with anticipation. Harrison Enterprises wasn't just another corporation. Founded by tech visionary Richard Harrison 30 years ago, it had grown from a garage startup into a conglomerate worth $40 billion. The company's annual investor meeting was legendary in Manhattan's business circles, not just for the massive profits announced, but for the exclusive guest list that read like a who's who of global finance. As Marcus finished cleaning the lobby's crystal chandeliers, he watched the first guests arrive. Rolls-Royces and Bentleys lined the street outside, their chauffeurs opening doors for men in hand-tailored suits and women draped in jewelry that cost more than most people's homes. These weren't just wealthy individuals. They were the people who controlled entire industries, whose decisions affected millions of jobs worldwide. Richard Harrison himself was already in the building, a man whose reputation preceded him into every room. At 68, he'd built his empire through a combination of brilliant innovation and ruthless business practices. He was known for two things: his ability to spot profitable opportunities others missed, and his complete intolerance for mediocrity. Harrison didn't just expect excellence, he demanded it from everyone around him. The evening's entertainment had been planned months in advance. Harrison had hired Victoria Chen, a world-renowned pianist who commanded $50,000 for a single performance. Her reputation was built on technical perfection and an ability to make classical music feel accessible to audiences more comfortable with profit margins than piano sonatas. Marcus had heard staff talking about Victoria Chen's reputation. She'd performed at Carnegie Hall, recorded albums that topped classical charts, and was considered one of the finest interpreters of Rachmaninoff's compositions alive today. For tonight's performance, she'd prepared a selection designed to complement the evening's theme of innovation and transformation. As the sun set behind Manhattan's skyline, casting long shadows through the hotel's tall windows, Marcus finished his preparations for the evening. He'd cleaned every surface in the ballroom twice, arranged chairs with mathematical precision, and ensured that even the piano bench was positioned exactly where the performer would expect it. The irony of spending his days preparing a stage for dreams he'd been forced to abandon wasn't lost on Marcus. But he'd made peace with his circumstances, or at least convinced himself he had. Some people were born to perform on stages, others were born to prepare those stages. His role was clear, and he'd accepted it. What Marcus couldn't have known as he put away his cleaning supplies and prepared to watch another evening of privilege unfold from the shadows was that tonight would be different. Tonight, the boundaries between audience and performer, between invisible and essential, were about to be shattered in ways that would change not just his life, but everyone in that room. The Harrison Enterprises investor meeting began exactly as Richard Harrison had planned. 200 of the world's most influential investors filled the plaza's grand ballroom, their combined net worth exceeding that of many small countries. The evening had started with cocktails and networking, followed by Harrison's presentation on the company's record-breaking quarterly profits and ambitious expansion plans. Marcus watched from the service corridor, as he always did during major events. He'd learned to position himself where he could observe without interfering, ready to address any issues that might arise while remaining invisible to the guests. Tonight's crowd was particularly impressive, even by plaza standards. He recognized faces from magazine covers, CEOs whose companies employed hundreds of thousands of people, investment fund managers who controlled pension funds for entire nations. Victoria Chen had arrived 2 hours early, as professional musicians always do. Marcus had glimpsed her during sound checks, a petite woman in her 40s whose presence commanded the massive ballroom despite her small stature. She'd tested the Steinway's action, adjusted the bench height, and run through difficult passages from her planned repertoire. Everything had been perfect. The dinner portion of the evening proceeded flawlessly. Harrison delivered his keynote address to enthusiastic applause, announcing new partnerships that would expand his company into emerging markets. The atmosphere was electric with the kind of energy that surrounded massive financial opportunities. Champagne flowed freely, conversations buzzed with insider knowledge of market movements, and everyone anticipated the evening's musical finale. Richard Harrison took the microphone at exactly 9:30, as scheduled. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried easily through the ballroom's acoustic excellence. Tonight we've discussed innovation, transformation, and the pursuit of excellence that defines Harrison Enterprises. To close our evening, I'm honored to present Victoria Chen, whose artistry embodies these same principles of dedication and mastery. The applause was polite but enthusiastic as Victoria walked gracefully toward the piano. She wore a stunning black gown that caught the ballroom's crystal chandelier light, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the room. This was her element, the moment when months of preparation would culminate in a performance that would be remembered and discussed long after tonight ended. Victoria reached the piano bench, acknowledged the audience with a slight bow, and prepared to sit down. Her hands were already positioned above the keys, her mind focused on the opening measures of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, when something went wrong. It happened so quickly that most of the audience didn't immediately understand what they were witnessing. Victoria's face suddenly went pale, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she swayed slightly. Her hand moved to her chest, and for a moment, she looked confused, as if trying to remember where she was. Then she collapsed. The sound of Victoria Chen hitting the marble floor beside the grand piano was like a gunshot in the previously elegant atmosphere. The woman who moments before had been poised to deliver a world-class performance now lay motionless, her black gown spread around her like spilled ink. Chaos erupted instantly. 200 of the world's most powerful people, accustomed to controlling every aspect of their environments, suddenly found themselves confronted with a situation money couldn't immediately solve. Voices rose in concern and confusion. Chairs scraped against marble as people stood for better views, and the carefully orchestrated evening dissolved into uncertainty. "Is there a doctor in the house?" Richard Harrison's voice cut through the noise, his businessman's instinct to take control asserting itself even in crisis. 3 physicians in the audience rushed forward, immediately beginning medical assessment while someone called 911. Marcus watched the scene unfold from his position in the service corridor, his heart racing. He'd witnessed medical emergencies before in his years at the hotel, but never during such a high-profile event. The irony struck him immediately. A room filled with people who could buy hospitals couldn't restore consciousness to one collapsed pianist. The doctors worked efficiently, checking Victoria's pulse and breathing, trying to determine what had caused her sudden collapse. "She's stable," one announced loudly enough for the worried crowd to hear. "But she needs immediate medical attention. The ambulance should be here within minutes." As paramedics arrived and began their professional assessment, it became clear that Victoria Chen would not be performing tonight. The woman who had traveled from San Francisco specifically for this event, whose reputation was built on reliability and professionalism, was being carefully loaded onto a stretcher and prepared for transport to Mount Sinai Hospital. Richard Harrison found himself facing a dilemma that his 3 decades of business experience hadn't prepared him for. 200 of his most important investors remained in the ballroom, their evening's entertainment literally being wheeled out on a stretcher. The careful choreography of his perfect corporate event had collapsed as suddenly as his hired performer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison addressed his guests, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. "Obviously, tonight's musical presentation will need to be postponed. I apologize for this unexpected situation. Please feel free to continue enjoying the evening's hospitality while we—" His words trailed off as he realized the fundamental problem. These weren't tourists content to drink champagne and make small talk. These were serious investors whose time was worth thousands of dollars per hour. They'd come expecting a complete experience, and half of that experience had just been taken away in an ambulance. The silence that followed Harrison's unfinished announcement was deafening. 200 people who controlled billions of dollars in assets stood in an opulent ballroom, staring at an empty piano bench, waiting for someone to solve a problem that couldn't be fixed with money or influence. That's when something extraordinary happened. From the service corridor where he'd been observing the crisis unfold, Marcus Williams made a decision that would change everything. He'd spent 3 years being invisible, 3 years accepting his place in the shadows, 3 years watching other people's dreams come true, while his own remained locked away. Not tonight. Marcus stepped out of the shadows and into the ballroom proper. His gray janitor's uniform stood out starkly against the sea of expensive evening wear. His presence immediately noticeable precisely because it was so unexpected. Conversations stopped as people noticed this uniformed employee walking purposefully toward the front of the room. Richard Harrison, still holding the microphone, watched in confusion as Marcus approached. Hotel staff weren't supposed to enter the ballroom during events unless specifically summoned, and certainly not when the host was addressing his guests. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. "I couldn't help but overhear. If you need someone to play piano tonight, I can help." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything these powerful people thought they knew about talent, worth, and their own assumptions about the world around them. Richard Harrison stared at Marcus Williams for several seconds, his business-trained mind trying to process what he'd just heard. Around them, 200 of the world's most influential investors waited in suspended silence, equally stunned by the janitor's unexpected offer. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Harrison's voice carried a mixture of confusion and barely contained frustration. His perfectly planned evening was already in shambles, and now his hotel's janitorial staff was apparently offering unsolicited entertainment services. Marcus felt every eye in the room focused on him. 3 years of invisibility had taught him to avoid exactly this kind of attention, but something deeper than fear was driving him now. "I said I can play piano, sir. If you need someone to perform tonight, I'm offering to help." A murmur rippled through the crowd. These were people accustomed to making split-second decisions involving millions of dollars, but none of them had ever encountered a situation quite like this. A few of the younger investors pulled out their phones, recognizing that whatever happened next might be worth recording. Harrison looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of his guests. He'd built his reputation on calculated risks and unconventional thinking, but this was pushing even his boundaries. "You're a janitor," he said, not unkindly but with obvious skepticism. "What makes you think you can perform for an audience like this?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question from the moment he'd stepped out of the shadows. What did make him think he could walk into a room of millionaires and sit at a $50,000 piano? The honest answer was that he didn't think. He knew. "I've been playing since I was 7 years old, sir. I studied classical piano for over a decade before life took me in a different direction. I know it's unconventional, but I can give your guests the performance they came here to hear." Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a prominent venture capitalist sitting in the third row, leaned forward with interest. She'd built her fortune by recognizing potential in unexpected places, and something about this janitor's quiet confidence intrigued her. "What would you play?" she asked. Marcus turned toward the voice, surprised to find support from an unexpected source. "I was planning to perform the same pieces Ms. Chen had prepared. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, some Chopin, perhaps Debussy's Clair de Lune to close. I've been practicing them after hours." The admission that he'd been using the hotel's piano without permission should have gotten him fired on the spot. Instead, it seemed to add authenticity to his claim. Richard Harrison found himself facing a decision that would be discussed in business schools for years to come. "This is insane," whispered Margaret Foster, a pharmaceutical heiress whose family's foundation funded major orchestras worldwide. But even as she spoke, curiosity crept into her voice. "Has anyone actually heard him play?" Harrison looked around the room again, reading the faces of people whose opinions shaped global markets. He saw skepticism, certainly, but also something more dangerous to ignore: genuine interest. These weren't people who were easily entertained, and the novelty of the situation had captured their attention in ways that traditional corporate entertainment rarely achieved. "If I let you do this," Harrison said slowly, "and you embarrass yourself and everyone in this room, it'll be the last thing you do as an employee of this hotel. Do you understand that?" Marcus nodded. He understood the risk he was taking, not just with his job, but with something more important: the dream he'd kept alive through 15 years of disappointment. If he failed tonight, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be the final proof that he'd been fooling himself all these years about his abilities. "I understand, sir. I won't embarrass anyone." Harrison made his decision with the same decisive speed that had built his empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the crowd, "it appears we have a volunteer pianist. I can't promise you what we're about to hear, but I can promise you it will be unlike anything you've experienced at a corporate event." The applause that followed was uncertain, scattered, and tinged with nervous energy. This was no longer a conventional business evening. It had become something entirely unpredictable. Marcus walked to the piano with steady steps, even though his heart was pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. The Steinway Model D concert grand seemed to glow under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers, its ebony finish reflecting the faces of 200 skeptical millionaires. He sat on the bench Victoria Chen had adjusted hours earlier, his work-worn hands hovering over keys that had been touched by some of the world's finest pianists. For a moment, the weight of the situation threatened to overwhelm him. These weren't the empty halls where he'd practiced in secret for 3 years. This was real, with real consequences and real people whose opinions could make or break what happened next. Then Marcus closed his eyes, placed his fingers on the keys, and remembered why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the ballroom with a power and precision that silenced every conversation, every whispered doubt, every skeptical assumption about what a janitor in a gray uniform could possibly accomplish. The transformation was immediate and absolute. This wasn't a hotel employee playing piano. This was a master musician who happened to work as a janitor. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped with the kind of musical intelligence that takes decades to develop. The technical passages that challenged professional pianists flowed from Marcus's fingers with an ease that made the impossible seem effortless. Dr. Patricia Hendricks felt tears forming in her eyes and didn't care who noticed. Margaret Foster stopped whispering entirely, her pharmaceutical fortune suddenly seeming less important than witnessing this moment of pure artistry. Richard Harrison, who had heard Victoria Chen perform in prestigious concert halls, realized he was hearing something rarer than technical excellence. He was hearing someone pour their soul into music. The first movement of the concerto lasted nearly 15 minutes, and for every second of that time, Marcus commanded the complete attention of people who were accustomed to commanding attention themselves. His years of invisible servitude had ended, replaced by a visibility so brilliant it redefined everyone's understanding of who he really was. When the final notes faded into silence, the ballroom remained quiet for several heartbeats. Then, slowly, Richard Harrison began to applaud. Dr. Hendricks joined him, then Margaret Foster, then others throughout the room, until 200 of the world's most powerful people were giving a standing ovation to a man they'd never really seen before. But Marcus wasn't finished. Without speaking, without acknowledging the applause, he transitioned seamlessly into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, his interpretation revealing layers of emotional depth that few pianists ever achieve. This wasn't just performance, this was revelation. As the evening continued, with Marcus moving through his impromptu repertoire with the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, everyone in that ballroom began to understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. They were seeing talent that had been hiding in plain sight, excellence that had been dismissed because it came dressed in work clothes rather than formal wear. The invisible man had become impossible to ignore, and nothing would ever be the same again. When Marcus Williams finished his final piece, Debussy's Clair de Lune, the silence in the Plaza Hotel's ballroom was different from the shocked quiet that had followed Victoria Chen's collapse. This was reverent silence, the kind that follows truly transformative experiences. 200 of the world's most powerful people sat motionless, processing what they had just witnessed. The standing ovation, when it came, was unlike anything these business leaders had ever given. These were individuals who applauded quarterly earnings reports and successful merger announcements with polite, measured enthusiasm. This applause was raw, emotional, and sustained for nearly 3 minutes. Richard Harrison was the first to approach the piano, his usual commanding presence replaced by something approaching humility. "Marcus," he said, and using the janitor's first name felt like a small revolution in itself. That was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. Dr. Patricia Hendricks was close behind, her venture capitalist's eye for hidden value fully engaged. "Where did you study?" she asked. "Who was your teacher? How is it possible that someone with your talent is working as a janitor?" The questions came rapidly from multiple directions as Marcus found himself surrounded by people who, an hour earlier, wouldn't have noticed if he'd been in the room. But something had shifted more fundamentally than just their awareness of his musical ability. These successful individuals were confronting their own assumptions about worth, talent, and the invisible people who made their privileged lives possible. Marcus answered their questions honestly, telling them about his grandmother's sacrifices, his interrupted education, his family's medical crisis, and the 15 years of dream deferral that had led him to this moment. As he spoke, several people in the audience began recognizing uncomfortable parallels to their own stories of opportunity and privilege. Margaret Foster, whose pharmaceutical fortune had funded music education programs at inner-city schools, felt a profound shift in her understanding of those programs' importance. "How many others are out there?" she asked quietly. "How many people with extraordinary talents are working invisible jobs because they never got the chances we take for granted?" Richard Harrison was thinking along similar lines, but with the practical mindset that had built his business empire. "Marcus," he said, "I have a proposition for you. But first I need to ask you something important. If money weren't an issue, if you could do anything you wanted with your life, what would it be?" The question struck at the heart of everything Marcus had buried for 15 years. "I'd want to perform," he said simply. "I'd want to teach. I'd want to help other people discover that music can transform their lives the way it transformed mine tonight." Harrison nodded slowly. "Then let's make that happen. I'm offering you a position with Harrison Enterprises as our Director of Arts and Culture Development. Your job would be to create and oversee programs that identify and nurture artistic talent in unconventional places. Your salary will be $300,000 annually, plus benefits, plus a budget to develop whatever initiatives you think can make the biggest difference. The offer hung in the air like an impossibly beautiful melody. Marcus felt the magnitude of the moment, not just the financial transformation, but the opportunity to turn his personal experience of buried talent into a mission that could change other lives. But Dr. Hendricks had her own proposal. Marcus, I'd like to discuss something else with you. My foundation has been looking for the right person to lead a new initiative we're calling the Hidden Talents Project. It would involve partnerships with businesses nationwide to identify and develop artistic abilities among their employees. The position would offer similar compensation to Richard's offer, but focus specifically on music education and performance opportunities. As the evening continued, Marcus found himself fielding multiple job offers, consulting opportunities, and invitations to perform at venues he'd only dreamed of accessing. But more importantly, he was witnessing a broader transformation among the people around him. The investors weren't just offering him opportunities, they were questioning their own organization's structures and assumptions. How many talented people were being overlooked? How many contributions were being dismissed because they came from unexpected sources? How many innovative solutions were being ignored because the person proposing them didn't fit traditional leadership profiles? James Morrison, a tech CEO whose company employed over 50,000 people worldwide, committed to implementing talent identification programs across all his organization's divisions. Not just for arts, he explained to Marcus, but for any exceptional abilities that might be hiding in plain sight. If someone with your level of talent can spend 3 years invisible in a hotel, what might we be missing in our own companies? The conversation continued past midnight, evolving from Marcus's individual story into a broader examination of systemic issues around opportunity, recognition, and the true nature of human worth. These powerful individuals found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about their own assumptions and the structures that had enabled their success, while potentially limiting others. Marcus accepted Richard Harrison's offer, but with modifications that reflected his new understanding of his own power and purpose. Instead of simply creating corporate arts programs, he negotiated the establishment of the Harrison Foundation for Undiscovered Talent, with himself as founding director and a mandate to work across industries and communities. Within 6 months, Marcus Williams had performed at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, and the Kennedy Center. But more importantly, the foundation he now led had identified and supported over 200 individuals whose extraordinary abilities had been hidden by circumstance, assumption, or simple lack of opportunity. The story of the janitor who became a concert pianist became legendary in business circles, not just as an inspirational tale, but as a case study in the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and traditional qualifications. Business schools began teaching courses on hidden human capital, using Marcus's story as a starting point for examining how organizations might better identify and develop the full range of talents their employees possess. Victoria Chen, who had made a full recovery from what turned out to be severe dehydration and exhaustion, became one of Marcus's closest collaborators. Together, they developed masterclasses that paired established artists with newly discovered talent, creating mentorship networks that bridged the gap between natural ability and professional opportunity. Richard Harrison's investor meeting had been intended to showcase innovation and transformation in business. Instead, it became the catalyst for a more profound transformation in how an entire network of influential people understood human potential and their responsibility to recognize it. 3 years later, Marcus Williams stood at the same Steinway piano in the Plaza Hotel's ballroom, but this time he was there as the keynote speaker for the annual Hidden Talents Foundation Gala. The audience included many of the same faces who had witnessed his breakthrough performance, but also dozens of individuals whose own talents had been discovered and developed through programs inspired by that night. As Marcus began his address, he reflected on the journey from invisible janitor to recognized artist and social entrepreneur. But the most important transformation, he told his audience, hadn't been his own elevation from anonymity to acclaim. The most important transformation had been learning that talent, dignity, and worth aren't determined by job titles, paychecks, or social positions. 3 years ago, he concluded his speech, I was the same pianist I am today. The music was always there. The ability was always present. The passion never diminished. What changed wasn't my talent. What changed was the willingness of people in this room to see beyond their assumptions and recognize that extraordinary things often come in ordinary packages. The applause that night was warm and appreciative, but it lacked the shocked intensity of that first evening. And that, Marcus reflected as he took his bow, was perhaps the greatest success of all. In a room full of powerful people, the idea that a janitor might be a virtuoso pianist no longer seemed impossible. It had become simply, beautifully human.